Hi everyone, my apologies. This is going up a little late on Sunday. I have spent the last 3 hours arguing with my computer after it insisted on the program, updating another program, which knocked everything off. And well, I'm sure you guys have gone through the same thing. Anyway, fun with technology. So I'm going to upload the book this evening, so you guys have that. I'd like you guys, it's hard to believe that we're already like on week 3 for class, and that time is just flying by. So I will get that uploaded this evening. If you guys could just start skimming, reading, and let me know what you guys think. That's always helpful. I will have your quizzes graded as soon as I possibly can. Keep in mind, we have a rather large class size, which, don't get me wrong, I love that. But it just means that I have quite a bit to grade, and it's all in essay form because I'm stubborn, and I like essay because to me, it really tests what you guys know. So today we're focusing on invasive species, and so these are species that most of the time humans end up carrying and dropping off at places they don't belong. So this has actually changed quite a bit as how much we've shuffled around invasive species. Initially, remember, so early human migrations focused on hunting and gathering. They didn't take a whole lot with them, not much of a chance of, taking extra species. Later, the lifestyles changed to agriculture, we became somewhat sedentary. Not gonna lie, I'm a big fan of that. However, we're still not really sure how much exchange from region to region took place, but eventually with the Industrial Revolution, humans began to move around again, and travel became more commonplace, and plants and animals actually got shuffled around purposefully as well as inadvertently, so on purpose and accidentally. So when you're talking about invasive species, we have to define a few things first. First off is the term biome. So a biome is basically a climate where plants and animals have evolved, okay? And so they're well suited to that climate because that's what they're used to. And so when you think of a biome, you can think of tropical rainforest, you can think of a boreal forest, you can think of prairie, that's another type of biome. And you guys can see here, we actually do share similar climate to certain areas in Europe and so forth, so where we share similar biomes. Now, that doesn't mean we have the same species, by the way, necessarily, but a lot of times there are similar representatives in each spot. So, we have spruce trees in our boreal forest. In Europe, they have spruce trees in theirs. They're very often a different species, but, when you have a similar biome most of the time, you're going to have species that evolve that have similar characteristics. We also have what's known as biogeographic realms. Now, the person who came up with this idea was Alfred Russel Wallace, okay? And so a biogeographic realm is an area that's separated from others that has certain climates and species that are native or naturally evolved in that particular area. So we have the Nearctic, which is North America. We have the Neotropic, which is tropical areas, which of course I wish we were there now. We have, we got Palearctic and so many others. No, you don't have to memorize these. There are several of them. Biogeography, by the way, is the study of where species are distributed. Okay, so that biogeographic realm, species are distributed within each of these regions, tend to be very similar, and we know that they evolved there. Okay, so now an invasive species is when you bring another species into a biogeographic realm, and it does so well that it causes harm to another species. I'll say that again, don't panic. In the next few slides, we're going to visit that very closely. But I just want you to get an idea of how invasive species relate to biogeographic realms. Now, when it comes to invasive species, remember, they're considered invasive because they invade an area and they cause harm to either the area or other species, okay? So they're very obviously species that are moved from one habitat to another. They tend to be generalists, which means that they will prefer a wide variety of habitats or food sources. They tend to also reproduce quickly, okay, so they can have a lot of offspring. They compete aggressively for resources, and very often this is what harms other species. And then the idea is they lack natural enemies or pests in this new environment. So that's why they start growing and growing and growing, and they kind of get out of control after a while, and that's part of the problem. So let's sneak a little science in here. When it comes to ecology, well, this is it's silly. Class is all science, but let's sneak a little hardcore ecology in there, okay? So when it comes to ecology, we know that there are two different life history strategies. The first is called a K strategist, and the second is called an R strategist. K strategists tend to have long lives, they produce very few offspring, and they have a lot of parental care. So we tend to think of humans in this area as well as elephants and all sorts of other critters. Okay. Now, R strategists tend to be small, they have a short life cycle, and they have many offspring. Okay, and they also these guys I tend to think of the party hard, die young group. And we have this running joke in my family that this is us. Because my family always tends to die young. I'm not trying to be sad. I just think it's funny that we call ourselves our strategists. Yes, perhaps we need to get out more. So there's a difference between what's called an exotic or alien species and an invasive species. Okay, so exotic species means that they're introduced, but they're not considered to be a pest. So they kind of settle in, but they don't overtake everything, and they kind of just find their own niche in the environment. And one example is Queen Anne's lace, which is on the right. You guys have probably seen that all over the place. Another example are the hedge apple trees, that's on the left. Believe it or not, they used to put those hedge apples in drawers to try to keep moths out from destroying clothing. Interesting fact. But we also need to recognize another ecological term called the tens rule. Okay, so a lot of species each year get introduced to the United States, and from the US get introduced to Europe. Okay, of those, 10%, only 10%, will actually stick around. All right, and then of that 10%, how do I phrase this? 10% of that 10% will likely become invasive. Okay, so of all the species that get introduced to the US every year, 10% will stick around, becoming exotic, and of those, 10% will become invasive. Hopefully that makes sense. And yes, that only comes down to like 1% is what that means. But the tens rule just kind of makes it easy to remember how many will actually survive and stick around too. So the reason we care about invasive species are because they displace or they outcompete native species. They generally tend to reduce the quality of native habitat. They reduce forest health and productivity. Very often they alter ecosystem processes or services. Remember we talked about that? And they will very often degrade recreation areas. So invasive species are not something that we want to stick around because ultimately they cause us harm. Now, it's known as a big no-no to purposefully drag species around and introduce them into new areas these days because we've had so many issues when it comes to invasive species. But believe it or not, back in the day, people did this on purpose. One example is the European starling was introduced in North America when the American Acclimatization Society for European settlers released some 80 to 100 birds in Central Park in New York City between 1819 and 1891. Does anyone else besides me think this was a horrible idea? The head of this organization, his name was Eugene Scheffling, and his whole idea was to introduce all birds ever mentioned in the works of William Shakespeare to the United States. Okay, this was a horrible idea. Thanks so much, Eugene. So people quickly realized that this was a bad idea. These birds were a pest, and then they tried to start getting rid of them. So in Connecticut in 1914, they tried to scare the birds by fastening teddy bears to the trees, by firing rockets through the branches. The White House tried speakers that emitted owl calls to get rid of them. And columns around the U.S. Capitol were outfitted with electric wires. People have tried shooting, poisoning, trapping, repelling, frightening the birds, and yet they still are doing great. They have a lot of, plenty to eat and a lot of habitat to move around. What else does a species need? I told you this was a bad idea. Now, some species get introduced accidentally, meaning that they were brought from one area to the next on accident. One example, seen as the zebra mussel here, we'll revisit that in the next few slides. That was actually carried in the ballasts of ships. We'll talk about what that is in a minute. Other invasive species are very often introduced accidentally in unprocessed wood, fruit shipments. They very often can bypass natural barriers. These little guys can just move, around, and very often we don't detect them, and that's how they get from one area to the next. Now, the zebra mussels, as I said, were introduced and moved around in what are called ballast tanks. So whether you do or don't know what a ballast tank is, so we get a lot of imported things or items, whatever you want to call them, by shipping. Okay, and ships are made to haul most of the time. Now, what's really important to remember is that they actually do best when they're low in the water. Okay, before I met my husband, I dated a man that was chief engineer and a commercial sailor in Canada, and I learned way more about ships than I ever wanted to know. So, but the reason they have these ballast tanks is because the ships do so much better when they're down low in the water. Okay, so when they are packed full with items and things that they're moving around, that they're actually shipping, containers and so forth, they empty the ballast tanks and they rely on the what they're shipping to make them go down lower in the water. However, when they're empty, they're really high in the water and they are potentially could capsize. So what they do then is they fill these ballast tanks with water, okay, until they get to the next harbor where they're going to load up again. So the thing to remember is when they're filling these ballast tanks, they'll fill them from one part of the world, then they go to load up someplace for their cargo, and then they dump the water out. Well, whatever was in the ballast tanks, and you can see here from the picture on the bottom right, there could be a lot of different things in there. Okay, so back in the day, they didn't used to control this, and so they would just allow people to dump their ballast water wherever. But now, because we've had so many invasive species moving around, they control this much better than they used to. Now, zebra mussels are a pest. They were first found in Lake St. Clair between Huron and Erie, just off of Detroit, back in '88. Okay, so the problem is you can get a lot of these little guys in a small area, up to 70,000 individuals per meter squared. They likely came to North America in ballast water. They are all over Lake Erie. I'll tell you right now, a lot of times they will have just piles and piles of zebra mussel shells, and I'll show you that in a second. But the problem is they can actually clog intake pipes. They will actually kill other mussels. They're very much an invasive species, and they really cause harm to a lot of other individuals in the ecosystem. So these guys are one of the most expensive invasive / at one time were just exotic species. They will restrict the flow of water through intake pipes, and this can be a real issue if you have a cooling tank or drinking water or irrigation water. They'll basically clog everything up, as you can see from the picture on the upper left. They also will attach to boat hulls and docks and locks and breakwaters, and this increases maintenance costs, impedes waterborne transport. That pile on the right is nothing but mussel shells. Okay, and I've seen piles of that in Lake Erie, so they definitely are out of control there too, unfortunately. So unfortunately, these guys can attach to hard surfaces. Basically, they will attach to anything that doesn't move fast enough, okay? They have a free-living stage, and they also have a larval stage called a veliger. Okay, so females can produce up to 40,000 veligers. Think about it. One female can produce that many kids. Whew. These are typical characteristics of marine species, by the way, but these guys just do incredibly well. And as I said, they do kill other mussel species, and that's a bad thing. So you might be asking yourself, how in the world do they impact other species, especially other native clam species? And I would say, aha, that is an excellent question. So let's say you're another clam, okay, another mussel of some sort, and you are filter feeding. You're mostly buried under sediment, but some of you is still up top, minding your own business, okay, just doing your thing. And the next thing you know, you start getting covered with these crazy creatures that then grow into large creatures, and eventually they make it so you can't open or close your shell, and ultimately you die. Okay, so an awful way to go, and unfortunately this has taken out a lot of species that are already kind of suffering from pollution and so forth. So, you know, these guys are definitely unwanted by the other mussel species. So the reason some exotics are so successful and eventually they become invasive, they tend to be R-selected. They can colonize rapidly from just a few individuals. They also tend to be generalists, so they're not super picky about the environment, and they can eat a variety of different things. And a lot of times it just depends on the size of introduction. So let's say you have a whole bunch of veligers and some ballast water. You dump your water. Okay, if the species is introduced in large numbers, several times, several places, most likely it's going to stay. Okay, whether or not it becomes invasive just kind of depends on a lot of other factors, like, you know, how much of a generalist is it, you know, how many offspring does it have, and that type of thing. So you might ask yourself, why are certain ecosystems more vulnerable than others? And I would say also a good question. So diverse, undisturbed communities that have a lot of species are kind of packed full will have few invaders because there's no room. Okay. If you have a disturbed habitat, very often they will be full of invaders because there's a whole bunch of open, empty niches. For example, human residential areas, you'll very often find European species that were introduced and they live with humans. Rats, good example. Certain species of rats. With islands, they have little history with competitors, predators, parasites, or diseases. They're really good to be invaded, unfortunately. So they don't have a whole lot of competitors. They don't have many parasites or anything along those lines. Additionally, if you have a community with extinct species, they can be very easily invaded. So think about the North American horses, the native North American horses, okay? Remember, we ate them all when we moved over the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia. So the niche was there, and once the conquistadors brought their horses, and some either escaped or were let go, the niche was already there for them to be super successful. So that's why they're still around. Now, had we had our own North American horses, they may not have been so successful, and who knows what would have happened. Believe it or not, we are starting to realize that certain species of earthworms are actually considered to be invasive. Now, there was a picture of earthworms here, and it did not convert, but I've had so many issues with technology today, I just don't feel like fighting it, so I'm sorry. Picture earthworms in the dirt. The species that are invasive are the large Canadian earthworms, and what happens is they will get into a new area where because earthworms, we tend to think of them as being ubiquitous and being everywhere, but that's actually not the case. Some ecosystems don't have earthworms, or they didn't until humans introduced them there. And you might be thinking, how did they get introduced? Well, if you've ever gone fishing, okay, with family members or just gone by yourself, what do you do with your leftover earthworms? Very often we just let them go, okay? And that's how they become established and they become successful. So earthworms for certain ecosystems actually are considered invasive, especially if they're the large night crawlers. Those are definitely not native to the United States, not down here anyway. All right, once again, we're supposed to have a picture here of a plant called Creeping Charlie. So I'm going to tell you a story, and while I do, I would like you to open your web browser, whether it be Firefox, whatever you guys are using, Chrome, and I want you to Google Creeping Charlie. Okay, so I do have a story to tell you about Creeping Charlie, and this might help you remember it. Creeping Charlie is a herbaceous plant. I think it's a mint relative, but the interesting thing about it is that it will eventually, if it gets established in someone's yard, it will eventually take over and kill all the grass, okay? Now, I realize here it's not exactly the natural ecosystem because we're supposed to be in forest, but I hate to say it, I like a pretty lawn, okay? I'm old-fashioned and old, and I like a pretty-looking lawn. Well, when my husband and I first moved to Michigan, I will never forget one of the first things in one of the first houses we rented was the fact it had a beautiful lawn, and it was my favorite part of our yard. So in the very beginning when we lived there, and this was back when we lived in Ann Arbor, this was many years ago, when we first moved in, I remember that I was going to promise to myself I would take immaculate, care of the lawn because I wanted this lawn to stay pretty and to stay nice the way it was. I also happened to notice that our neighbor right next to us had a ton of Creeping Charlie to the point of where she had almost no grass. Okay. Well, I got busy. School started. It was my first year. Didn't quite know everything that was going on yet. Did not have time to take immaculate care of the lawn. Okay. And eventually the Creeping Charlie moved in. Fine. I knew it was going to happen. I just kind of lived with it. Then came the point where the neighbor, whose yard we got our Creeping Charlie, by the way, because hers was covered with it, ended up calling in a specialist to chemically kill the Creeping Charlie in her yard. The next thing you know, it's year 2 of our stay in Ann Arbor and of my years at Michigan, and her yard looks flawless, beautiful, tons of grass, just like the way ours used to. Ours was covered in Creeping Charlie. I was very sad, and I'm not going to lie, I was kind of mad. So hopefully you found a picture of Creeping Charlie by now. It's this cute little plant. It's got purple flowers, but you don't want it killing your lawn. Okay. So you might ask yourself, well, what in the world did she do then if she had the perfect lawn? And then the next thing you know it, a year later, her lawn looks like, and her neighbor's looks beautiful. Well, she did the very thing any self-respecting and kind neighbor would do. At nighttime, when the neighbor was as fast asleep and not paying attention, I'll admit I grabbed some creeping Charlie, pulled it up out of my yard, and threw it over the fence. Shh, don't tell anybody. So I tried to specifically do this many times because I wanted to share in the bounty of creeping Charlie that she shared with us. Shh. I think that makes me a bad person. Oops. Now, we also have many insects that have been moved over from other places, and a perfect example are Africanized bees. So in 1956, African honeybees were imported into Brazil. By 57, 26 queens escaped. Is anybody really surprised? In 1990, they reached the U.S. The problem is that they're more aggressive than European honeybees, and they've killed about 1,000 people. Okay, so you don't want to get attacked by one of these. So these will very obviously impact honey and pollination industries if they're out competing the normal bees, and basically these are bees that just are grumpy. So they're not super fun to be around. Now, a lot of our crop pests actually come from other countries too, and have been introduced, like the boll weevils, the corn borers, many of the mosquitoes. They carry malaria, as we know, and pox. Unfortunately, a lot of mosquitoes have driven over 20 Hawaiian bird species to go extinct. So these guys can definitely have some, horrible ramifications once they're introduced to an area. Now, another example of an invasive insect are the Asian longhorn beetles. Unfortunately, these guys will kill and attack and kill many native trees. You can see here the picture taken on the left. You have an area, I think it's in Chicago, where there were a whole bunch of trees. You compare that to the picture on the right, all the trees are dead and get taken out. Really has an impact on the landscape, and of course has an impact on the trees because, they're eventually going to die because the insects will overcome any of their defenses. Now, gypsy moths can also have a huge impact. Unfortunately, they were introduced in the 1860s, and the whole purpose was to use them for silk production. Unfortunately, some of them escaped, no big surprise, this happens, and now they can actually defoliate an entire forest. These guys are ravenous. They will end up eating everything and anything that they can get a hold of, and they have a ton of offspring. Okay, so, when you see these guys, I'm not talking about the webworms either. Many times when we drive in the summer, we see webworms, and those are just bagworms. Those will just be in trees, and they'll, cause some harm, but the problem with these guys is they'll eat up all the leaves and the trees can't photosynthesize, and then ultimately they die. There's a lot of examples of reptiles and amphibians that have been moved around. The cane toad is native to Central and South America. It was introduced worldwide to control insects because people thought it was a great idea. Unfortunately, they do have milky secretions that are highly toxic, and this will kill dogs, cats, and a lot of small native animals that try to eat them. So these guys were definitely not a good idea to introduce. I think there's a running theme here. So the brown tree snake, these guys were introduced to Guam through cargo ships transported by the U.S. military during World War II. Okay, these guys have overtaken everything. And on Guam, they've wiped out 9 of 13 indigenous bird species. It's crazy that they're everywhere, and apparently they're so numerous. You could be walking along, minding your own business, and have a snake all of a sudden just fall out of the air and fall on you. I think if that were to ever happen to me, I would run screaming off the island because, I understand snakes have their place in the ecosystems and all that, but I've never been a huge fan of them just because I'm always afraid that they're, planning to eat me. So, not that they ever could, but you know what I mean. I'm pretty stereotypical in that respect, that I'm not a big fan of the snakes, and I don't think I could live on Guam. To anybody who does, hats off to you. I don't think I could do it. Believe it or not, we have many mammals that have been brought over that are into areas they aren't supposed to be. So goats and pigs were brought over by humans, of course, and unfortunately in Hawaii they've wiped out a lot of native plants because, let's face it, a lot of them will eat anything. Now I can identify with that to a point, but not when you're wiping out native plants. Horses in the Grand Canyon are causing a lot of erosion. That's not good. People have brought game animals into certain areas, and they're called texotics because a lot of times they go to Texas, like the oryx that you see there. Those don't belong in Texas, by the way. They were just brought there for hunting. So Yeah, that probably wasn't a good idea necessarily either, because then if they're really successful, it causes issues, as we well know. Now, a great example of a plant that it was introduced in 1876 is kudzu. Okay, so it was promoted as a forage crop and an ornamental plant until 1953, because what people eventually realized is it will kill other plants by smothering them in a solid blanket of leaves. And you can see the picture. This is a forest with trees. It's all covered by kudzu. I will actually tell you, when I lived in Illinois and I was going to grad school, I was pretty big on gardening. And I'll never forget, I was out there trimming one day my rose bushes, and I noticed this plant growing over top of it. Well, I'd never heard of kudzu at that point and didn't know what it was, but I recognized relatively quickly it was starting to cover everything. So I ripped it out as fast as I could, threw it in the trash, learned later what it was, and for once I was actually preemptive in something. Because once I realized how well it does, I was really glad I'd gotten rid of it. Now, another example is known as garlic mustard. It's not a good food for herbivores. Because of that, it's kind of poses a threat to plants and animals. It outcompetes native plants by taking all the light, moisture, nutrients, soil, and space. So it basically runs everybody out. Nothing good comes of that, as we know. Now, our last example focuses on fish, and we're going to look at an example where there are a couple of species were introduced on purpose, and then they seem to have taken over. Lake Victoria, you can see here, more than 30 million people depend on this lake for survival. It's next to Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, split between them. You can see it in a map that's over to the right, okay? So a lot of people depend on the fishing industry. This is how they survive with regards to making a living. Now, Lake Victoria was famous for its cichlid population, okay? There were over 300 species that evolved there that have been described from Lake Victoria. So they have all sorts of different niches. They have all sorts of different jobs. Some of them scrape plants, some of them crush snails, some of them pick off parasites, some of them eat crabs. You can see they all have their little niches, okay? And all these different species were living perfectly happily. Well, initially the traditional fishery was dominated by hundreds of native species, okay? But unfortunately, as humans became more efficient, they introduced gill nets and other gear in the early 1900s, and as you would expect, this led to overfishing to where people were having a really hard time eking out a living, okay? So they started overfishing. It was great at first because they had tons of fish, but it was not so great in a very short amount of time because they were basically running out of fish. So in the 1950s, several new species were introduced to Lake Victoria. They were trying to compensate for the declining stock of native species. One example is the Nile tilapia, which eats zooplankton, and the second example is the Nile perch, which is a carnivore and eat fish. Now, this might seem like a great idea initially because it's definitely restocked the lake. However, there were definitely some downsides. Unfortunately, one thing that was not considered as these fish were introduced is there's a major life history difference between the native and exotic species. Well, the cichlids, those are the native ones, provide parental care. Okay, so they will have a relatively small number of eggs. The eggs are pretty large. Okay, the exotics, on the other hand, have much higher birth rates and no parental care. What does that sound like? Oh yeah, an invasive species. Okay, so what do we do when we see a graph? Number one, we do not panic. Okay. Number two, we read the axes. So, year is on the x-axis, going from 70 to 90, which means 1970 to 1990. Then we go to the y-axis, which is kilograms per hectare. Okay. Now, one more component to read of this is that the native species are in black and the introduced species are in gray. 1970, almost all native species. 75, 77, mostly native species. However, the introduced species are starting to make a comeback. By 83, it's mostly introduced species, and by 90, it's all introduced species. In case you're curious, this is known as the most rapid vertebrate mass extinction in recent history. Okay, because all the native species just went extinct from this lake, which stinks. So basically what this means is what had been a fishery of well over 400 species was now dominated by three. 80% Nile perch, 20% tilapia, and omena. Okay? As the native species declined, Nile perch were running out of food, so they started feeding on the native shrimp, Cardina nilotica, okay, which you can see a picture of here. And as they started to feed on those fish, anybody who was in the shrimp, started to feed on those shrimp, Anybody who is in the shrimping industry started having real trouble because that's kind of what you'd expect if your fish were all of a sudden eating all of those little guys. Other problems with Nile perch include the fact they destroy gear, they cannot be sun-dried, they can be smoked, because remember they need to be preserved, but unfortunately that requires wood. They also tend to favor large-scale fishing operations, which unfortunately for the humans that depend on the smaller operations means they're going to have malnutrition, unemployment, and poverty. I'm afraid nothing good came of this. On that happy note, this is our last slide. Sorry, guys. So let's discuss what we can do to prevent the spread of invasive aquatic species. Don't ever dump your bait buckets, inspect your gear, boats, and trailers for exotics, empty all the water before you leave a site, rinse your equipment in your boat, wash your dog. I can't tell you how many times my crazy Labradors have gone diving through a lake or a pond or a wetland or something and come out with more seeds on them than I care to think about. One time, I kid you not, it took me 45 minutes to clean my dog off because she had so many seeds on her. She was green. I thought I was going to strangle her. She was fine, don't worry. Let your equipment dry for several days. This doesn't necessarily work for all species, but it will for some. Okay? So this is the last part of Lecture 5. I'm going to go ahead and try and get Lecture 6 uploaded tonight. If you guys have any questions or concerns, let me know. I will get that uploaded as soon as I can. I'm going to try and get this one first. So I'll talk to you soon.